The first time I truly understood the word betrayal, I was standing in the cold room of our dairy barn with a tin pail of warm milk in my hand, watching my husband Jacob press his lips to a letter written in a handwriting I did not recognize. That alone might not have broken me. A letter is just paper, and a kiss is just a gesture, but it was the look on his face that split my heart right down its center. It was a tenderness so deep and so private that I felt like a trespasser on my own farm, an intruder in my own marriage. He folded the paper with the care a father gives a sleeping child, slid it inside his black barn coat, and looked up. When he saw me standing there in the wedge of gray winter light, his face did something I will never forget. It rearranged itself completely, wiping away the softness and replacing it with a pleasant, empty smile that belonged to a stranger. "Miriam," he said, and his voice was perfectly normal. "I didn't hear you come in." I could not speak. My mind was already racing backwards through all the late evenings he'd spent in the workshop, the buggy trips to town that took an hour longer than they should, the way he sometimes sat at the supper table with his fork hovering over his plate like a man who was eating a different meal in a different room. The signs had been there, scattered like seed corn across the years of our life together, but I had never gathered them into a pile and looked at them squarely until this very moment. Who was writing to my husband? What words could possibly make a plain Amish dairy farmer's face glow with such secret joy? And why, after 17 years of marriage and 4 children together, had I just witnessed a version of Jacob Lapp that I had never been allowed to meet? Our farm sat on a gentle rise of land in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, where the soil was dark and rich, and the fences stood straight because Jacob's grandfather had set them that way 70 years ago. We milked 40 head of Holsteins, grew corn and alfalfa on 60 acres, and lived in a white clapboard farmhouse with a wide porch that caught the afternoon sun in summer. My kitchen smelled perpetually of bread and coffee and the faint, sharp sweetness of fresh milk. I had always believed this place was the whole of my world, the sturdy container that held everything precious and true. That morning, the container suddenly felt fragile as an eggshell, and I was holding it in trembling hands while a crack snaked silently across its surface. I set the milk pail on the cold concrete floor. "I came to see if you needed help with the new calf," I said, and my voice sounded thin and distant, like someone calling from across a windy field. "She's nursing strong," Jacob said easily. "No need to worry." He picked up a pitchfork and began spreading fresh straw in the corner pen, his movements unhurried and competent. He was a tall man with sandy hair that curled at the edges of his straw hat, broad-shouldered from a lifetime of physical work, with hands that could gentle a frightened heifer or soothe a crying baby. I had loved those hands for almost 2 decades. Now I found myself studying them for traces of something I could not name. I could have confronted him right then. I could have demanded to see the letter, could have asked the name of the woman whose words he kissed like a sacred object. But I didn't. Some part of me understood that once those words were spoken aloud, everything would change, and I was not yet ready to lose the life I knew. So I did something that I would later recognize as both cowardice and a strange form of wisdom. I nodded, picked up my pail, and walked back to the house through the thin crust of snow that had fallen overnight, leaving my husband to his secrets and his straw. That afternoon, I went through the motions of my day like a wind-up clock. I scrubbed the kitchen floor until my knees ached. I kneaded bread dough with more force than necessary, pressing my knuckles into the soft resistance of flour and yeast until my fingers cramped. Our 2 youngest children, 6-year-old Hannah and 9-year-old Levi, played checkers by the wood stove while our older daughters, 14-year-old Rebecca and 16-year-old Sarah, worked on their sewing projects in the front room. The ordinary sounds of my family surrounded me, the click of game pieces, the murmur of girls' voices, the crackle of the fire, and I felt as if I were hearing them through a thick pane of glass. That evening at supper, we bowed our heads for silent prayer while the meatloaf steamed on its platter and the mashed potatoes pooled with melting butter. Jacob sat at the head of the table where he had sat for every meal of our marriage, his hair still damp from washing up at the sink, his expression serene. He asked Levi about his arithmetic lessons. He complimented Rebecca on the neat hem of the dress she was sewing. He was so thoroughly, achingly present that I almost convinced myself I had imagined what I saw in the barn. But when he passed me the bread basket and our fingers brushed, I felt nothing. That was the most terrible part. The electrical current of connection that had always hummed between us, even through arguments and hard times, had simply gone silent. That night, I lay awake beside my sleeping husband and listened to the wind worry the loose shingle on the north side of the roof. I thought about the seasons of our marriage. We had married young, as our people did. I was 19, he was 21, and we had grown up together in the truest sense. We had buried Jacob's father when he was only 52, struck down by a heart attack in the cornfield on an August afternoon, so hot the crows sat panting in the maple trees. We had lost a baby between Sarah and Rebecca, a tiny boy who came too early and never drew breath, and I had watched Jacob weep with an abandon that made me love him more fiercely than ever. We had built this dairy herd from 20 cows to 40, had survived droughts and milk price crashes, and the year hoof rot ran through the herd like a plague. We had done everything together, or so I believed. Now a crack had appeared, and I did not know how deep it went or how long it had been spreading beneath the surface of our shared life. 3 days passed, each one a small eternity of watchful waiting. I paid attention to things I had previously let slide past my notice. Jacob took the buggy into town on Thursday afternoon to pick up a part for the milking machine, and he was gone for almost 4 hours. When he returned, he smelled faintly of coffee that was not from our kitchen, and there was a quiet contentment in his manner that struck me as deeply suspicious. He hummed while he repaired the pulsator, a hymn I did not recognize. He came to bed late and fell asleep quickly, his breathing deep and untroubled, while I stared at the ceiling and turned my questions over and over like stones I was trying to polish smooth. On Friday morning, I did something that shamed me but also felt necessary, something I would never have imagined myself capable of before that week. While Jacob was in the barn for the first milking, I went through the pockets of his barn coat. The coat hung on its peg by the back door, its canvas worn soft by years of weather and work. My hands trembled as I reached into the inside pocket where I had seen him tuck the letter. It was still there, folded into a neat square, the paper thin and slightly crumpled from being carried against his chest. I pulled it out and unfolded it with the care of someone handling evidence, which is exactly what it was. The handwriting was feminine, there was no question of that, rounded letters, careful loops, written with a fountain pen on paper that had a faint lavender watermark in one corner. But what stopped my breath was not the penmanship. It was the words. "My dearest," the letter began. "The photograph you sent is my most treasured possession now. I keep it in my Bible and look at it every morning when I wake. I know this separation is necessary, and I accept the reasons you have given me, but my heart counts every day until the moment we can finally be together without secrets between us. You asked if I am well cared for, and I want you to know that I want for nothing. The arrangement you have made is generous, and I am comfortable here. But comfort is not the same as happiness, and I will not be truly happy until I can call you by your real name in the light of day. Your loving Ruth." I read the letter 3 times, standing beside the peg where the coat still swayed slightly from being disturbed. The kitchen was silent except for the ticking of the clock on the mantel and the distant lowing of cows from the barn. My mind seized on details and tried to make sense of them. A photograph of my husband sent to a woman named Ruth. An arrangement that was generous. A separation that was necessary. A real name that could not be spoken in the light of day. Jacob Lapp, the man I had shared my bed with for 17 years, was providing for another woman. He had sent her his likeness. He had made promises to her, promises so serious that she kept his photograph in her Bible. I refolded the letter carefully along its worn creases and returned it to the coat pocket. Then I walked to the kitchen table and sat down heavily in the chair nearest the window, looking out at the gray January sky and the bare branches of the oak tree in the yard. My hands were shaking, but my mind had gone strangely calm, the way a pond goes still just before a storm breaks. Who was Ruth? Where was she living, in whatever comfortable arrangement Jacob had made for her? How much of our money we had earned together through years of dawn milkings and careful economies, was going to support this other life? And what was the secret of Jacob's name that she alluded to with such painful longing? The back door opened, and Jacob stamped snow from his boots on the mat. I did not turn around. I could not yet arrange my face into the mask of normalcy that the situation demanded. "Cold one this morning," he said, hanging his hat on its hook and coming to the stove to warm his hands. "The water trough had ice thick as your thumb. I'll need to check the heater," I said, not trusting my voice. He poured himself a cup of coffee from the percolator and sat down across from me with a contented sigh. This was our morning ritual, these few quiet minutes before the children woke and the full weight of the day descended. Usually I treasured this time. Today it felt like a performance. "You're quiet," he observed, blowing across the surface of his coffee. "Just tired," I said. "Didn't sleep well." He nodded sympathetically and reached across the table to pat my hand. His touch was warm and familiar and utterly devastating. How could the same hand that comforted me also fold love letters from another woman into a hidden pocket? How could the same eyes that looked at me with such easy affection also gaze at a photograph of this Ruth with something that made her treasure his image in her Bible? I pulled my hand away on the pretext of standing up to check the oven. I could not bear his touch right now. The children came down for breakfast in their usual clatter of bare feet and sleepy greetings. I moved through the familiar motions of serving oatmeal and toast, pouring milk, reminding Levi to wash behind his ears, helping Hannah tie her apron strings. All the while my mind was working furiously, examining the problem from every angle like a carpenter, sizing up a piece of warped lumber. I needed to know more before I confronted Jacob. I needed to understand the full shape of what had been hidden from me. If I accused him now, he might deny everything, might destroy evidence, might find ways to continue the deception more carefully. No, I needed to be patient. I needed to watch and wait and gather the truth piece by piece until I had enough to make him face it squarely. What I did not know then, what I would not discover for many weeks, was that the truth I was seeking was far more complicated than a simple story of marital unfaithfulness. The letter from Ruth was not the beginning of the mystery. It was only the outermost branch of a root system that ran deep and tangled beneath everything I thought I knew about my husband, about our marriage, and about the very identity of the man I had pledged my life to before God and our community. The second letter appeared 10 days later. By then I had developed a routine of checking Jacob's coat every morning while he was in the barn, a practice that filled me with shame, but also with a desperate need to know. I had become two Miriams, the one who went about her daily work with a calm face, and the one who was conducting a secret investigation into her own husband. This letter was shorter than the first, but it contained details that made my heart pound with a mixture of fear and terrible fascination. "My dearest, thank you for the additional funds. The winter has been mild here, but coal is still dear and I was grateful for the extra. You asked in your last letter about my health. I am well though tired. The child grows strong, I feel movement every day now. I have begun to hope that this one will stay, that all the heartbreak we have endured will finally give way to joy. I know you cannot be here, and I accept the reasons. But I dream of the day when we can raise this child together in the sunlight without shadows. Keep faith, my love. I am keeping faith for both of us. Your Ruth." There was a child coming. My husband was going to be a father again and not with me. I sat down on the floor of the kitchen, right there on the worn linoleum, and pressed my hands against my stomach as if I had been physically struck. The room tilted around me. The child grows strong. I feel movement every day now. The words were a knife turning in my chest. I thought of my own children sleeping upstairs, of the baby we had lost, of all the nights Jacob had held me while I wept for that tiny boy. Now another woman was carrying his child, and he was sending money for her coal, and I had been living in complete ignorance of it all. But even through the blinding pain of that revelation, another detail from the letter snagged my attention and would not let go. I have begun to hope that this one will stay, that all the heartbreak we have endured will finally give way to joy. All the heartbreak. Not just one lost pregnancy, but a pattern of loss. How long had this relationship been going on? How many children had they tried to have together? I forced myself to stand. I forced myself to fold the letter exactly as I had found it and return it to the coat pocket. I splashed cold water on my face at the kitchen sink and gripped the edge of the counter until my knuckles went white. In the window glass, my reflection stared back at me, a plain Amish woman of 36 with dark hair pulled back under her cap, with faint lines around her eyes from years of squinting into sun and wind, with a face that had always been called handsome rather than pretty. What was Ruth like? Was she younger, prettier? Had she been someone from our community, someone I knew? I could not go to anyone with this. That was the thought that kept circling back to me as I mechanically began preparing the day's bread. In our Amish community, personal troubles were meant to be handled within the family and the church, but how could I take this to Bishop Baylor? How could I sit across from that stern, kind old man and explain that my husband had a secret family hidden somewhere like a shameful disease? The humiliation would be unbearable. And worse, if Jacob were placed under the ban for adultery, he would be shunned. Our family would be fractured in full view of everyone we knew. Our children would carry the stain of their father's sin. No, I had to handle this myself. I had to find out who Ruth was and where she lived. I had to understand the full dimensions of Jacob's betrayal before I decided what to do about it. That Sunday was a preaching Sunday, and we hosted the service in our barn, as was our family's turn in the rotation. The benches had been delivered by wagon the day before, and the house was filled with the smell of the food we would serve afterwards. Ham loaves and pickled beets and snitz pie and fresh bread, enough to feed the 100 or so people who would gather. I moved through the preparations in a daze, accepting help from my sisters-in-law and neighbors, smiling when I was supposed to smile, answering questions about the children and the farm while my mind was miles away. Jacob, as was his custom for hosting, was everywhere at once, helping the men set up benches, greeting families as they arrived in their buggies, carrying in armloads of hymnals. He was respected in our district, my husband. People sought his opinion on matters of farming and church discipline. Young men looked up to him. Mothers hoped their daughters would find husbands as steady and devoted as Jacob Lapp. I watched him moving through the crowd with his easy confidence and wanted to scream. The 3-hour service passed in a blur of German hymns and sermons. I sat on the women's side with Hannah on my lap and tried to focus on the words of the ministers, tried to find some comfort in the familiar rhythms of worship. But every time I closed my eyes for prayer, I saw the words of Ruth's letters written on the inside of my eyelids. I dream of the day when we can raise this child together in the sunlight without shadows. At the shared meal afterwards, I found myself standing near the food tables with a plate I had barely touched, watching Jacob talk with Deacon Stoltzfus about the price of replacement heifers. His face was animated, his gestures open, his laugh genuine. He was a man without a care in the world, it seemed. A man who had successfully partitioned his life into compartments that never touched. "Miriam, you look peaked," said my sister Katie, appearing at my elbow with a concerned expression. Katie was 3 years younger than me and had always been the perceptive one, the one who noticed things. "Are you feeling poorly?" "Just tired," I said, the familiar lie rolling easily off my tongue. "Busy week." Katie studied my face for a moment longer than was comfortable. "If something were wrong, you would tell me, wouldn't you?" "Of course," I said, and the falsehood burned in my mouth like a hot coal. The following week, I decided to search Jacob's workshop. It was a small outbuilding behind the barn where he repaired harness and kept his tools and did the bookkeeping for the farm. I knew there was a desk there with ledgers and receipts, and I hoped that somewhere among the papers I might find an address or a clue about where he was sending money. I chose a Tuesday afternoon when Jacob had taken a load of heifers to the livestock auction in New Holland, a trip that would keep him away for most of the day. The children were in school at the one-room schoolhouse a mile down the road. I had the farm to myself, and the silence felt both liberating and oppressive as I walked through the thin crust of snow to the workshop door. The workshop smelled of leather and machine oil and the faint sweetness of pipe tobacco, though Jacob had given up his pipe years ago when the bishop had preached against it. The desk sat under the one small window, its surface cluttered with invoices from the feed store and the creamery and the veterinarian. I sat down in the wooden chair and began methodically going through each drawer. The first drawer held what I expected: tax records, breeding schedules, receipts for equipment repairs. The second drawer was older records, going back 10 years or more. The third drawer was locked. I stared at the brass keyhole with my heart hammering. In 17 years of marriage, I had never known Jacob to lock anything. Our house had no locks on its doors. Our buggy had no lock. The idea that my husband kept a locked drawer in his workshop was so out of character that it felt like confirmation of everything I feared. I searched the desk for a key, checking under the blotter, in the pencil tray, behind the inkwell. Nothing. I looked around the workshop, scanning shelves and windowsills and the gaps between boards in the wall. Nothing. Finally, I went back to the house and retrieved a small screwdriver from the kitchen drawer where we kept odds and ends. Back in the workshop, I worked the flat tip into the gap between the drawer and the desk frame and applied careful pressure. The old wood creaked in protest, and then the lock gave way with a splintering sound that was far too loud in the quiet workshop. Inside the drawer was a small metal box, the kind that bank documents came in, and a stack of letters bound with a piece of twine. There were perhaps 20 letters in the bundle, all in the same feminine handwriting, all addressed to Jacob Lapp at a post office box in town, not our farm address, but a box that I had not known he maintained. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely untie the twine. I spread the letters across the desktop and began reading them in chronological order, starting with the earliest. The dates went back almost 4 years. 4 years of secret correspondence. 4 years of my husband writing to another woman, receiving her letters, holding them in his hands and reading words that were meant for him alone. The early letters were tentative, formal even. They spoke of shared memories that I could not decipher, of people I did not know, of events that must have happened long before Jacob came to Lancaster County. But as the correspondence progressed, the letters grew warmer, more intimate. By the second year, Ruth was writing openly of her love for him, of her loneliness, of her struggle to understand why they could not be together. The most recent letters contained the most disturbing information. They spoke of a place called Milbrook, which I gathered was a small town somewhere north of us, perhaps in upstate New York or New England. They referenced a house that Jacob had purchased for Ruth, a modest place with a garden and a view of hills. And they spoke again and again of the children. I corrected myself as I read more carefully. There had been multiple pregnancies, multiple losses. The current pregnancy was apparently the most promising, the one that had advanced far enough for Ruth to feel movement. The metal box contained financial records, receipts for money orders sent to a Ruth Miller at an address in Milbrook, New York. The amounts varied, but they added up to thousands of dollars over the past 4 years. My hands grew cold as I calculated the total in my head. This was not pocket money. This was a substantial portion of what we had saved, what we had worked for, what we had planned to use for the children's future and our own old age. But it was the final item in the box that truly stopped my heart. It was a photograph, old and worn at the edges, showing a young man of perhaps 20 standing beside a smiling young woman in a flowered dress. They were standing in front of a farmhouse I did not recognize, and the young man had his arm around the woman's shoulders with an easy, possessive familiarity. The young man was unmistakably Jacob, younger, thinner in the face, wearing English clothes and a broad smile that I had never seen on my husband's face. And the young woman had to be Ruth. I turned the photograph over. On the back, in Jacob's handwriting, was written, Jacob and Ruth, Milbrook, 2003. The last good day. I had met Jacob in 2006, when he came to Lancaster County from somewhere in New York State, looking for work as a farmhand. He had been baptized Amish, he told everyone, but his family had been scattered and he was seeking a new start in a new community. He had been hardworking and serious and devout, and I had fallen in love with him within 3 months of his arrival. We were married in 2007, and he had never once mentioned a woman named Ruth or a town called Milbrook. The photograph was dated 2003, 3 years before I met him. This was not a recent affair. This was a previous life, a life he had left behind and then resumed in secret, a life that included a woman who clearly believed she was still his true love and who was now carrying his child. I sat in the dusty workshop with the evidence of my husband's double life spread before me, and I felt the ground of my existence shift beneath my feet. Every memory I had of our marriage suddenly required re-examination. Every tender moment, every shared struggle, every whispered confidence. Had any of it been real? Or had I been sharing my bed with a man whose heart had always belonged to someone else? The crunch of buggy wheels on the gravel drive snapped me back to the present. Jacob was home early. With frantic haste, I gathered the letters and the photograph and the financial records and stuffed them back into the box. I shoved the box into the drawer and pushed the drawer closed, hoping the broken lock would not be immediately noticed. Then I slipped out of the workshop and hurried back to the house, arriving in the kitchen just as Jacob came through the back door. "Auction was faster than I expected," he said, stamping snow from his boots. "Good prices on the heifers, we did well." I nodded, my face arranged in what I hoped was a normal expression. "I'm glad, I'll put coffee on." He smiled at me, that same easy smile he had worn for 17 years, and I looked at my husband as if seeing him for the first time. "Who are you, Jacob Lapp?" I thought. "What secrets are you carrying behind those kind eyes?" The next morning, I packed a small bag and told Jacob that my sister Katie had asked for help with her new baby and that I would be gone for a day or two. It was the first deliberate lie I had ever told my husband, and it slid out of my mouth with surprising ease. He accepted it without question, even offered to drive me to Katie's in the buggy, which I declined. I did not go to Katie's. I took the bus from Lancaster to Milbrook, New York, a journey of some 6 hours that carried me through the winter-brown farmlands of Pennsylvania and into the rolling hills of the southern tier. I had never traveled so far alone. The very act of stepping onto a Greyhound bus felt like a transgression against the ordered life I had always known. But I was beyond caring about propriety now. I needed to see Ruth with my own eyes. I needed to understand what my husband had built in the shadows. The address from the money order receipts led me to a small white house on the edge of Milbrook, a tidy place with green shutters and a front porch, and a vegetable garden sleeping under its winter mulch. It was the kind of house a young couple might buy as their first home, modest but well-kept, with a swing on the porch and lace curtains in the windows. The sight of those curtains, chosen and hung by another woman, struck me with unexpected force. Jacob had helped choose those curtains. Jacob had sat on that porch swing. Jacob had a whole life here that existed entirely without me. I found a small cafe across the street and ordered coffee I did not want, positioning myself at a window table where I could watch the house. For 2 hours, nothing happened. Then, around 3 in the afternoon, the front door opened, and a woman came out onto the porch. She was perhaps 35, with honey-brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, wearing an English dress of blue cotton and a heavy sweater against the cold. Her figure was rounded with pregnancy, perhaps 5 or 6 months along. She carried a watering can and moved slowly among the pots of dried herbs on the porch, touching each one with a tenderness that made my throat tight. Her face was plain and kind, with worry lines around her eyes that deepened when she paused to look down the road as if waiting for someone. This was Ruth. This was the woman who wrote letters that my husband kissed like sacred objects. This was the mother of the child growing inside her, Jacob's child, a half-sibling to my own 4 children who knew nothing of this place or this woman or the secret that was about to shatter their family. I had expected to hate her. I had prepared myself for the hot rush of jealousy, the bitter resentment of the wronged wife. But sitting there in that cafe window, watching Ruth water her dead herbs with such patient hope, what I felt was not hatred. It was a strange, aching sadness that encompassed both of us. 2 women on opposite sides of a man's deception, both loving him in our different ways, both betrayed by his choices. Because I realized, watching her touch the dried rosemary with her fingertips, that Ruth was as much a victim of Jacob's secrets as I was. The letters had made it clear that she did not know about me. She believed that Jacob was prevented from being with her by some mysterious circumstance, some obstacle that would eventually be overcome. She was waiting faithfully for a man who had already given his name and his vows to someone else. The question was, did I walk across the street and tell her the truth? Did I destroy her hope as mine had been destroyed? Did I reveal to this pregnant woman that the man she loved was living a double life, that the future she dreamed of was built on a foundation of lies? I finished my coffee and paid my bill and walked out into the gray winter afternoon. I stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, looking at the little white house with its green shutters and its porch swing and its waiting woman. Then I turned away and walked back toward the bus station. I could not confront her. Not yet. I needed to confront Jacob first. I needed to hear from his own lips the explanation for all of this, the story of how he had come to be two men in two different places, and what he intended to do about the wreckage he had created. The bus ride home was long and dark, and I spent it staring at my reflection in the cold window glass, trying to find the strength for what came next. I arrived home late that night, catching a ride from the bus station with an English neighbor who asked no questions but looked at me with curious eyes. The farmhouse was dark except for the kitchen light, which Jacob always left burning when I was away. I let myself in quietly and stood for a moment in the familiar space. The pine table, the braided rug, the row of cookbooks on the shelf, the children's drawings pinned to the wall. This was my home. This was the life I had built. And it was all balanced on the edge of a knife. Jacob was asleep in our bed. I stood in the doorway and looked at him, this stranger I had married, this man who had fathered my children and shared my table and kept a locked drawer full of another woman's hopes. "Jacob," I said, and my voice was louder than I intended. "Wake up, we need to talk." He stirred, blinking in the dim light. "Miriam, what time is it? Is everything all right?" "No," I said, switching on the bedside lamp. "Everything is not all right. Everything is very far from all right. I know about Milbrook. I know about Ruth. I know about the child." The words fell into the quiet room like stones dropped into still water. Jacob went completely still, his face draining of color until it was the pale gray of winter sky. "How?" he whispered. "That doesn't matter," I said, and my voice was shaking now. "What matters is that you tell me the truth, all of it, from the beginning. Who is Ruth? Who are you? Because the man I married, the man I have lived with for 17 years, apparently does not exist." Jacob sat up slowly, swinging his legs over the side of the bed. He was wearing the blue pajamas I had sewn for him last Christmas, and the sight of him in those familiar clothes, with his hair rumpled and his face stricken, nearly undid me. But I held myself together. I had to hear the truth. "Her name is Ruth Miller," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We grew up together in a community in upstate New York. I was going to marry her. We were engaged." "In 2003, I said. "The photograph." He looked at me with something like wonder. "You found the photograph." "I found everything, Jacob, the letters, the money orders, the locked drawer. I went to Milbrook, I saw her." The silence stretched between us like a wire pulled taut. Then Jacob did something I did not expect. He began to weep. Not the quiet tears I had seen when we lost the baby, but great, wrenching sobs that shook his whole body. He buried his face in his hands, and the sound that came out of him was the most terrible thing I had ever heard. A grief so deep, and so long suppressed, that it seemed to come from the very bottom of his soul. "I never meant for any of this to happen," he said when he could speak again. "You have to believe that, Miriam. Please, let me tell you the whole story." I sat down in the chair by the window, as far from the bed as I could get while still being in the same room. "Then tell me." What followed was a story that I could never have imagined, a story that rearranged everything I thought I knew about my husband and our life together. Jacob had been born into an Amish community in New York State, the youngest son of a strict and sometimes violent father. When he was 19, he fell in love with Ruth Miller, the daughter of a neighboring farmer. They planned to marry, to start a life together, to build a home and a family in the community where they had both been raised. But Jacob's father had other plans. There was a long-standing feud between the two families, a dispute over land boundaries that went back a generation. When Jacob's father learned of the engagement, he flew into a rage and forbade the marriage. When Jacob refused to break off the relationship, his father gave him an ultimatum: end the engagement or be disowned. Jacob chose Ruth. His father disowned him. For a year, Jacob tried to make his own way. He worked as a hired hand on English farms, saved what he could, and dreamed of the day he and Ruth could marry. But without family support, and without the community's blessing, the path forward was painfully difficult. The bishop of their district sided with Jacob's father. Ruth's parents, fearing the scandal and the conflict, pressured her to end the relationship. The young couple found themselves increasingly isolated, increasingly desperate. Then came the accident. Jacob's father, driving his buggy home from town on a rainy night, was struck by a car and killed instantly. At the funeral, Jacob's older brothers blamed him for their father's death. The stress of the conflict, they said, had made their father careless. The community, already inclined to side with the established families, turned against him entirely. Jacob was shunned. He was told to leave and never return. "I had to go," Jacob said, his voice raw with old pain. "They made it clear that if I stayed, Ruth would be shunned too. Her family would be ostracized. Her life would be ruined. The only way to protect her was to disappear." So Jacob had fled to Lancaster County, taking a new last name, Lapp, his mother's maiden name, and starting over as a farmhand. He had been baptized in his new community, had met me, had fallen in love with me. And he had genuinely loved me. That was the part he kept repeating. The part I could see in his eyes was true. He had loved me completely, had built a life with me, had been happy with me. But he had never been able to let go of the guilt. "Ruth didn't know where I had gone or why I had left," Jacob said. "She thought I had abandoned her. She was destroyed by it. Her parents married her off to an older widower in the community, and it was a terrible marriage. He was cruel to her. She lost 2 babies in 3 years. Then he died of a heart attack and she was alone again, and I found out about it from a cousin who still wrote to me sometimes." "So you contacted her," I said. "I had to. I had ruined her life, Miriam. I had left without explanation, and she had suffered for years because of it. I wrote to her to apologize, to explain what had happened. I thought that would be the end of it. But it wasn't the end. Ruth had written back, and then Jacob had written again, and gradually the correspondence had deepened into something more. Ruth still loved him, she had never stopped loving him, and Jacob, torn between 2 lives, had found himself unable to let go of either one. "I sent her money because she had nothing," Jacob said. "Her husband had left debts. She was going to lose the house. I couldn't let her starve." "And the child?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Jacob looked at me with eyes full of anguish. "I went to see her, once 2 years ago. I told you I was going to an auction in Ohio. I was weak. I was wrong. I have no excuse for it. The child is mine." The words hung in the air between us, irrevocable and devastating. I had known it intellectually from the letters, but hearing him say it aloud was different. It made it real in a way that could never be undone. "What happens now?" I asked. Jacob shook his head slowly. "I don't know. I have been trying to figure that out for 4 years. I love you, Miriam. You and our children are my life, but I have done a terrible wrong to Ruth, and I cannot simply abandon her again." The night passed in fragments of conversation, long silences, and more tears than I had shed since we buried our infant son. By the time the gray light of dawn began to seep through the curtains, I understood the full shape of Jacob's betrayal and the impossible position he was in. He had not chosen this double life out of callousness or simple lust. He had stumbled into it through a combination of old trauma, misplaced guilt, and genuine love for 2 different women. That did not make it right. It did not erase the lies or the stolen money or the child growing in another woman's womb. But it made it human, and that humanity was the hardest thing of all. It was easier to hate a villain than to forgive a broken man. "I need you to leave," I said, as the first birds began to sing outside the window. "Go to the workshop, stay there. I need time to think, and I cannot think with you in this house." Jacob nodded, his face gray with exhaustion and grief. He dressed silently and went out the back door without another word, and I was left alone in the bedroom we had shared for 17 years, surrounded by the wreckage of everything I had believed was true. The days that followed were the hardest of my life. I told the children that their father was sleeping in the workshop because he was working on a difficult project that required late hours. They accepted this with the easy trust of children who had never been given reason to doubt their parents. But Rebecca, my 14-year-old, looked at me with sharp, questioning eyes that told me she knew something was wrong. I went through the motions of my daily work while my mind churned endlessly over the same questions. Could I forgive Jacob for this? Could I share my marriage with the ghost of another woman and another child? What would happen to our family if I turned him out? What would happen to Ruth and her baby if I demanded he sever all contact? On the third day, I did something I should have done at the very beginning. I prayed. Not the formal prayers of church service, but the desperate, wordless cry of a heart that had reached the end of its own strength. I knelt on the cold floor of my kitchen while the bread dough rose on the counter and the soup simmered on the stove, and I poured out my grief and my confusion and my anger to God. And in the silence that followed, I felt something shift. Not an answer exactly, but a direction. A sense that I was being asked to do something harder than either leaving or staying. I was being asked to understand. I went to the workshop that afternoon. Jacob was sitting at his desk with his head in his hands, surrounded by the evidence of his double life that I had left scattered across the surface. He looked up when I came in, and his eyes were full of a desperate, fragile hope. "I want to meet her," I said. "I want to meet Ruth." The drive to Milbrook took 7 hours in a hired car, because I could not face the journey in a bus again, and Jacob could not be seen driving me in his buggy. We drove in almost complete silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. The winter landscape rolled past the windows, fields and barns and small towns and stretches of bare forest, and I watched it all with the strange detachment of someone who was no longer sure which world she belonged to. Ruth was not expecting us. When she opened the door of the little white house and saw Jacob standing on her porch, her face lit up with such pure joy that I had to look away. Then she saw me, and the joy flickered into confusion, and then into something that looked very much like fear. "Ruth," Jacob said, his voice gentle and steady in a way I had not heard in weeks. "This is Miriam, my wife. She knows everything." The three of us sat in Ruth's small living room, with its braided rug and its wood stove and its shelf of books, and we talked for hours. I learned that Ruth had believed Jacob was still trying to resolve the conflict with his family, still trying to find a way back to her that would not destroy her standing in the community. She had believed that I did not exist, that Jacob was a single man struggling to reclaim his life. The discovery that he had been married for 17 years, that he had 4 children, was a blow that made her face go white and her hands shake. But Ruth was stronger than I had expected. After the first shock passed, she did not weep or rage or demand that Jacob choose. She sat very still, her hands folded over her pregnant belly, and asked me quiet questions about our life, our children, our farm. I answered honestly, and in the answering I realized that I was not speaking to an enemy. I was speaking to a woman who had been wounded by the same man who had wounded me, a woman who had also loved truly and waited faithfully and been repaid with secrets. "I didn't know," Ruth said, looking at Jacob with eyes that held both love and horror. "All this time, I thought you were alone. I thought you were waiting for me." "I should have told you," Jacob said. "I should have told both of you. I was a coward. I couldn't bear to lose either of you, and so I built a house of lies, and now it has fallen on all of us." The baby chose that moment to kick, and Ruth shifted in her chair with a small grimace of discomfort. I watched her hand move automatically to soothe the movement, and I felt something crack open in my chest. This child was innocent. Whatever Jacob had done, this baby growing inside Ruth was blameless, and it deserved to be born into something better than a nest of secrets and shame. "What do you want?" I asked Ruth. "If you could have anything, what would it be?" She was silent for a long moment. "I want my child to know its father," she said finally. "I want to raise this baby without lies. I want to stop hiding and stop waiting and stop pretending that everything is fine when it isn't. I want to live in the truth, whatever the truth turns out to be." I nodded slowly. "Yes," I said, "that is what I want too." The solution that emerged over the following weeks was not clean or simple or anything like the life I had imagined for myself. It was a compromise, a patchwork, an arrangement born of necessity and grace, and the stubborn determination to do better by our children than we had done by each other. Jacob and I stayed married. Despite everything, Despite the anger that still flared in me at unexpected moments and the trust that would take years to rebuild, I loved him. And he loved me. That was the strange and stubborn truth that I could not escape. The marriage we had built over 17 years was real, even if it had been constructed on a foundation that included a hidden fault line. But we did not ask Ruth to disappear. Instead, we found a way to bring her into the light. Jacob acknowledged the child publicly as his own, a confession that cost him his position on the church council and subjected him to a period of discipline and repentance. It was the hardest thing he had ever done, I think, harder even than leaving his first community with a false name and a broken heart. As for Ruth, she moved to Lancaster County in the spring when her baby was 3 months old. She found a small house in town and began attending a different church district, one where she could start fresh without the weight of scandal. Jacob provided for the child, a little girl, born healthy and strong, named Hope, and visited regularly, with my knowledge and eventually my acceptance. It was not a conventional arrangement. There were people in our community who judged us harshly, who believed I should have sent Jacob away, who whispered that Ruth should have been shunned for bearing a child outside of marriage. But Bishop Baylor, after a long conversation with me in which I told him the whole truth without flinching, surprised everyone by counseling compassion. "The measure we give will be the measure we receive," he said to the congregation when the matter was finally discussed. "There is sin here, yes, and it has been confessed and repented. But there is also love here, and children who need their father, and 2 women who have shown more grace than most of us could muster. Let us not add to their burden with our judgment." The first time I held baby Hope, I expected to feel resentment. She was the living proof of my husband's betrayal, the visible evidence of everything that had been hidden from me. But when Ruth placed the tiny bundle in my arms, what I felt was something entirely unexpected: wonder. The baby opened her eyes and looked at me with the unfocused gaze of newborns everywhere, and I saw Jacob's eyes looking back at me. This little girl was my children's sister. She was family, however complicated and unconventional the ties might be. "I'm sorry," Ruth said, standing beside me with her hands clasped nervously at her waist. "For everything. For the part I played in this, even unknowingly." I looked at this woman who had been my rival and had become something else, not quite a friend, but something more than a stranger. We were bound together now by choices we had not made and circumstances we had not chosen, 2 women holding opposite ends of a rope that was tangled beyond untangling. "I'm sorry too," I said, "for the years you waited alone, for the losses you suffered, for the fact that no one told you the truth." She nodded, and her eyes filled with tears, and we stood there in the spring sunlight while Hope slept, and somewhere across town, Jacob was picking up our children from school and bringing them home to the farm where 3 generations of his family had lived. A farm that would now have to grow large enough to accommodate a much more complicated understanding of what family meant.